This is my true story. I worked my whole life so my son could live well. I built a home with my own hands and thought one day it would protect both of us. But I was wrong. When I got old, the same son I raised turned cruel. He looked me in the eye and said words I'll never forget. "This house is mine now." Then he pushed me out like I was nothing. I stood on the street while he locked the door behind me. My heart broke, but I didn't fall apart. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and ordinary, until it wasn't. I woke up early, made breakfast like I always did, and sat at the kitchen table waiting for my son to come downstairs. I thought we would eat together. Instead, he came down already dressed for work, phone in hand, talking loudly to someone about money. He didn't even look at me at first. When he did, his face wasn't the face of a son anymore. It was the face of a man who thought he owned everything he saw. He grabbed the house keys from the counter, looked around and said coldly, "This house is mine now." At first, I thought I heard wrong. But before I could even process the words, he walked to the door, opened it, and threw my small travel bag out onto the porch. I had used that bag for vacations years ago. Now it was the only thing I had left in the house I built. He told me he needed the space, that I was too slow, too old, that it was time for me to move on. I watched him walk toward the driveway, open his car door, and laugh while driving away. That sound, his laughter, stayed in my ears longer than anything else. I stood there for a while, staring at the locked door. I didn't bang on it. I didn't yell or cry. I just stood still, letting the reality of it settle. I looked around. The neighbors were outside, pretending not to see, but I knew they did. A few of them gave me quick glances, half pity, half curiosity, but no one said a word. Everyone wants to see drama until it's time to step into it. I picked up my bag and sat on the curb for a long time. The air smelled of fresh rain and dust. It was strange to see the street from this angle, the same road I'd walked down every day for years. The same house I painted, repaired, and paid for now stood behind me like a stranger. My name was still on the title, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Possession is louder than paperwork. I thought back to how I built that house from nothing. I was young, full of energy, working long shifts at the factory, saving every dollar to buy that small piece of land. Brick by brick, wall by wall, I made it a home. I remember holding my son as a baby while standing in what would become the living room. I remember promising myself that this house would always be his safety net. I never thought it would become mine. After a few hours, I walked to the small bus stop at the corner of the street. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even have enough money in my pocket for a full meal. But I wasn't panicking. Something inside me was calm. Too calm, maybe. Because when someone crosses a line that deep, the fear leaves you. Only clarity stays. I knew I'd figure something out. That night, I slept on a bench near the park. The air was cold, and the sound of cars passing by kept me awake. I looked at the stars and thought of my wife, how she would have cried if she saw what her son had become. I kept thinking, where did I go wrong? How did the boy I fed, clothed, and educated turn into a man who could throw his father into the street without shame? The next morning, I went back to the corner near the house, not to go in, but to look at it one more time. The curtains were closed. His car was gone. The porch light was still on, the one I had installed myself years ago. It made me angry for a second, not because I was outside, but because he was using what I built and pretending it was all his. I didn't try to talk to him. I didn't want an apology. I just wanted to remember how this moment felt. Because deep down, I already knew something he didn't. That house wasn't as secure as he thought. There were things he didn't know about, papers, clauses, signatures from years ago that tied him to me in ways he'd long forgotten. So I turned around, walked away, and didn't look back again. He had the keys, but I had the knowledge. He had the title in his hand, but I had something stronger, patience. And patience, when used right, can move faster than any form of revenge. That was the day he took the keys. But what he really did was open a door for me. to a plan that would take everything he thought he owned and turn it back into mine. That night, I sat on a wooden bench behind the old bus station. The city lights were far away, flickering like memories I couldn't touch. My bag was beside me, a few shirts, a small towel, and a notebook full of old receipts. That was all I had left. But I wasn't broken. I was thinking. When people lose everything, they panic. When I lose everything, I count. I count years, I count favors, and I count paper, because paper always tells the truth. As the night grew colder, I started remembering things my son had forgotten. The time he needed money to start his first business, I signed the loan papers. The time he bought the house's extension, I co-signed the documents. The time I helped him register his company, my name was still printed as a secondary guarantor. He thought age made me forgetful, but I remembered every detail. I remembered every contract, every agreement, every signature. Because that's what men like me do. We build, and we keep records. When the streetlights turned off, I walked to the small cafe near the main road. They opened early, and I knew the owner. He saw me outside and gave me a cup of coffee without asking anything. I sat near the back, pulled out my notebook, and started writing down everything I could remember. Bank names, loan numbers, company registrations, property deeds. 40 years of work, written down line by line. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. He hadn't stolen my house completely. He had just taken the front door, the walls, the foundation, the land beneath it. Half of it was still tied to me by paper. Around noon, I went to the public library. They had free computer access for seniors. I sat down, logged in, and began searching. One by one, I pulled up records, old mortgage files, registration forms, archived government listings. There it was, our house, registered under both our names. My name came first. The law doesn't forget signatures. I printed everything, every file, every page. It cost me $2. The librarian looked at me strangely, maybe wondering why an old man was printing so many legal papers. But I didn't explain. When you're planning something big, silence is better than sympathy. That evening, I went to a small shelter downtown. They gave me a bed and a hot meal. I thanked them, then stayed awake while everyone else slept. I spread the papers on the thin mattress, reading them over and over. Each document was like a memory, proof that I wasn't powerless, proof that the man who built the house still had roots in it. I remembered the attic of that home, full of old folders, dusty boxes, and contracts I'd stored for decades. My son had probably never opened them. He didn't know they existed. Somewhere in those boxes was the final piece I needed, the trust deed I'd signed 20 years ago. It gave me control over the property in case of unfit occupancy or negligence. At the time, it was just a precaution, something my lawyer had advised after a bad business deal. But now, that paper could end everything for him. I smiled quietly in the dark. My son thought the game was over. He didn't know I had been playing longer than he had been alive. Every deal he made, every company he started, every house he bought, all built on credit, connections, and my name. Without my name, none of it stood. And soon, that name was going to come back to him like a storm. The next morning, I borrowed the shelter's phone and called my old lawyer. He hadn't heard from me in years, but he remembered me immediately. When I told him what happened, he didn't sound surprised. "Do you still have the trust papers?" he asked. I told him I could find them. He said, "Then he's not the owner. He's just a tenant who got too comfortable." That line stayed in my head all day. A tenant who got too comfortable. I walked back toward the old neighborhood that afternoon, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to look. The house stood still, the same way I left it. Curtains drawn, lawn uncut, the paint peeling a little near the porch. I smiled again. When a man takes what isn't his, it starts to decay. That house wasn't his home. It was my history, and history doesn't let go so easily. That night, I went back to the shelter, folded my papers neatly, and placed them inside my bag. Tomorrow, I would visit the lawyer's office. Tomorrow, the quiet counting would turn into quiet action. Because when a father is thrown into the street, he doesn't fight with fists. He fights with proof. The first 2 nights after he threw me out were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep much. The shelter was small, full of other people who had their own stories of loss. Some were there because of bad luck, others because of betrayal. I fit somewhere in between. The bed was thin, the blanket rough, and the room smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain-soaked shoes. But I didn't complain. I was quiet. Everyone there looked tired. Tired in the same way I felt, not just in the body but in the spirit. Still, even among strangers, I kept my thoughts sharp. I wasn't there to die in a shelter. I was there to prepare. During the first night, I kept replaying that moment on the porch. The sound of the door slamming. His words. The way the neighbors had watched without saying anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. I could almost hear his voice echoing. This house is mine now. But the more I thought about it, the calmer I became. Because when someone throws you out, they think they've won. They don't realize that when you're stripped of everything, you gain something else. Freedom to act without being seen. The next morning, I helped the shelter staff clean up after breakfast. It wasn't my job, but I needed to stay busy. Work keeps the mind focused. One of the volunteers, a kind woman named Linda, asked if I was okay. I told her yes. I didn't explain. She smiled softly and gave me an extra cup of coffee. Small kindness feels big when the rest of the world has turned its back on you. That afternoon, I walked to a nearby park. The benches were wet from rain, but I didn't care. I sat under a tree, opened my bag, and checked all my papers again. The wind tried to snatch them from my hands, but I held tight. I traced my finger over the old signatures, especially the one with both our names, mine first, his second. That little detail mattered more than gold. It meant control. It meant authority. And I knew exactly what to do with it. Later that day, I took the bus back to my old neighborhood. I didn't go near the house. I stood across the street, just far enough not to be noticed. He had parked his car outside, the one I helped him buy years ago. There were new curtains in the window and a light on in the living room. He was inside, living comfortably, maybe even laughing with friends. Completely unaware that the same house he claimed was his had a secret chain tied to my name. It started raining again, but I stayed there for an hour. Watching the house didn't make me sad anymore. It made me determined. I realized something very simple. Revenge doesn't need rage. It just needs proof and patience. I went back to the shelter that evening and asked to use the phone again. The woman at the counter handed it to me kindly. I called my lawyer once more. This time, I gave him everything. The deed number, the trust clause, and the documents I had printed. He listened carefully. When I finished, he said one sentence that made me breathe easier. You still legally own the property. He can live there, but you can remove him. Those words gave me strength. I wasn't weak. I wasn't helpless. I was the owner of the home my son was squatting in. And now, I had the law on my side. That night, while everyone else at the shelter slept, I stayed awake again. I looked out the small window and watched the rain fall on the street. I realized how strange it was that I felt more peace in that small, crowded room than I had in my own home for years. Maybe because I was surrounded by people who had nothing to prove. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed my papers neatly, folded my blanket, and thanked the staff for their help. They asked where I was going. I said, home. They didn't understand what I meant, but I did. Because that house, the one my son threw me out of, wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of my life's work. And now, it was time to take it back. The bus ride to my lawyer's office felt long, but my heart was steady. I looked out the window at the passing buildings, each one reminding me of how much a man can lose and still recover. I wasn't going to shout or beg. I was going to sign. Quietly, legally, completely. When I got off the bus, I took one last look at the city skyline. I whispered to myself, "You can take a man's house, but you can't take his foundation." And that foundation, my knowledge, my name, my patience, was about to ruin the very life that tried to erase mine. The next morning, I reached my lawyer's office before the doors even opened. I stood there holding my papers close to my chest like armor. The receptionist let me in early once she saw my age. She recognized me immediately. I had been one of their oldest clients decades ago when I was still running my small construction business. My lawyer, Mr. Haynes, came out of his office with the same calm look he always had. He looked older too, but his mind was still sharp. When I handed him the folder of papers, he sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began reading. It didn't take long for his eyebrows to lift. He said what I already knew but needed to hear. You still hold partial ownership of the property, and under the trust clause you signed, you retain the right to revoke occupancy in case of abuse, negligence, or abandonment. He paused, looked at me and said, "That means you can legally take the house back." For a long moment, I didn't speak. It's strange how after being humiliated, just hearing that you can do something gives you your spine back. I nodded slowly and said, "Then let's begin." We spent the next 2 hours going through every old document, trust deeds, property certificates, business records. I had forgotten how many times I'd signed things to help my son get started. But this time, those same signatures became my defense. Mr. Haynes drafted a lien notice immediately. Then he contacted the county registry and filed to activate the trust's reversion clause. Within hours, the process began. There was no yelling, no police, no confrontation, just paperwork. Quiet, clean, final. That's the difference between revenge and justice. One makes noise, the other makes results. By late afternoon, I signed the last document that froze all property transfers linked to the house. My son couldn't sell it, rent it, or even refinance it now. It was locked legally until I said otherwise. And since the business loans he'd tied to the property used it as collateral, the chain reaction was already set in motion. Mr. Haynes called the mortgage company next. They confirmed the freeze. Then he smiled faintly and said, "He'll find out tomorrow morning." I didn't smile back. I just said, "That's soon enough." When I left the office, the air outside felt different, lighter. The city looked calmer, though it hadn't changed. It was me who had changed. I wasn't the same old man standing on the curb with a bag in his hand. I was a man with a plan, with the law behind me, and with nothing left to lose. I went to a small diner for dinner. I sat by the window, ate slowly, and thought about how everything had happened. I didn't hate my son. Hate takes energy, and I was done wasting mine. But I wanted him to understand what he had done, to feel the weight of his choices, not through shouting, but through silence backed by documents. Because in life, some lessons don't come from words. They come from losing the things you took for granted. By evening, Mr. Haynes called again. He told me the lien notice had already been delivered electronically to the financial institutions tied to my son's name. That meant all his access to property funds was frozen effective immediately. The next step, he said, would be a formal visit from legal representatives to the house itself. "You don't have to be there," he told me. "The papers will do the talking." I thanked him. When I hung up, I looked at my reflection in the diner window. I looked tired, but steady. My face had lines of age, but also lines of resolve. For the first time since that morning he threw me out, I felt no weakness, just purpose. I returned to the shelter one last time that night. I didn't unpack my things. I just sat on the bed, looking at the papers again. Everything was in motion now. There was nothing more to say or do. It's funny how quiet power feels. There's no noise, no thrill. Just the knowledge that the same man who was pushed into the street was now holding the keys again, not in his hand, but in law. I turned off the light, lay back, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, my son would wake up in the same house he thought he owned, but everything around him would already belong to me again. No arguments, no threats, no anger, just quiet paperwork, waiting to remind him who built the ground he stood on. The next morning, I woke up early, though I hadn't slept much. The shelter was still quiet, the others still asleep. I sat up, folded the blanket, and looked out the window. It was cloudy, but there was a strange peace in the air. Somewhere across town, my son was waking up too, but his morning would not be peaceful. I didn't rush to see what would happen. I knew how these things worked. Legal processes move quietly at first, then suddenly hit like thunder. I left the shelter, got a coffee from the corner stall, and walked to the park. It was strange to have a calm heart after so much chaos. Maybe because deep down, I knew it had already begun. The revenge wasn't loud. It was happening through emails, court filings, and system updates. And when those things move, no one can stop them. Around mid-morning, I stopped by the public library again to check my email. The lawyer had already sent an update. The lien and trust notices had been officially processed and attached to my son's property records. That meant one thing. Every financial institution connected to his name now knew the property was under review. He couldn't sell it, rent it, or borrow against it. His accounts were being flagged, his credit frozen. His power was slipping without him even realizing it yet. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened a social media tab and searched for his name, and there he was, smiling, confident, completely unaware of what was happening behind the curtain. He had posted a video just an hour earlier. Standing on the porch of my house, his arms crossed, sunglasses on, talking big about his new chapter. The caption read, "Hard work pays off. Never depend on anyone, not even family." I watched the video twice, not out of anger, but disbelief at his arrogance. He spoke like a man who thought he had conquered life, like the house was proof of his success. People commented things like, "Congrats, bro," and "You're an inspiration." None of them knew he had thrown his own father into the street to get there. None of them knew that behind that door, half of what he was showing off still legally belonged to me. For a moment, I almost laughed. It wasn't funny, but the irony was too sharp to ignore. He was celebrating ownership of a house that was already slipping from his hands. He was boasting online while the lawyers were drafting the next notice that would arrive at his door before nightfall. Pride is always loud before it gets quiet. I closed the tab, finished my coffee, and went for a walk. I didn't feel angry. I just felt steady. There's a strange strength that comes when you stop trying to be understood. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The law would do the talking for me. Around noon, my lawyer called again. His tone was calm, but satisfied. "The bank has acknowledged the lien," he said. "They've frozen his mortgage account and placed a temporary restriction on any financial activity connected to the property." That meant the bills, taxes, and insurance were all now my son's responsibility, but he couldn't access the money to pay for them. The perfect trap: legal, clean, irreversible. I thanked Mr. Haynes, hung up, and sat quietly under a tree. I could picture it clearly. My son waking up, smiling, having breakfast, and then checking his phone. Seeing the alerts from the bank. The confused look. The first flicker of panic. The calls to customer service that led nowhere. The pride starting to crack. He would call me soon, I knew it. Not because he cared, but because he would need something, and I would be ready. Not to argue, not to shout, just to listen. Because sometimes, silence hurts more than any words ever could. That evening, I walked past the street again, just once. The house looked the same. The curtains still drawn, the porch light still on. But everything about it felt different now. He was inside, but the walls no longer belonged to him. Every brick he claimed as his victory was now mine again. Not through force, but through patience. I stood there for a few minutes, then turned and walked away. I didn't need to see him lose his temper when he found out. I didn't need to watch the downfall. I had seen enough in life to know that when pride meets truth, it always collapses on its own. That morning, he woke up as a winner. By nightfall, he would realize the game was over, and I didn't even have to lift a finger, just a pen. By the next morning, the silence had broken. The plan I'd set in motion finally reached him. My lawyer called me early, around 7 a.m., and said in his usual calm tone, "It started." That was all I needed to hear. He didn't need to explain. I knew exactly what that meant. Notices had gone out to every institution connected to my son's business, personal accounts, and mortgage lines. What he thought was his safety net was now a trap of his own making. I decided to take a walk to the corner store that morning. The air felt sharp but clean. I bought a newspaper and sat on a bench near the park, as if it were just another normal day. People rushed past. Commuters, students, parents walking kids to school. I wondered if any of them ever thought about how fragile their comfort really was, how one document could change everything overnight. At exactly 9:13 a.m., my phone started vibrating non-stop. First a call, then another, then messages one after another. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. My son. I let the first call ring out, then the second, then the third. I finally looked. The messages were short and panicked. "Dad, what did you do? Why is the bank calling me? They froze everything." I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because there was nothing to say. I had warned him years ago about arrogance, about disrespect, about thinking you could build an empire by stepping on the people who built you. He laughed then. But now, his own words were catching up to him faster than he could type. Within an hour, my lawyer confirmed the full extent of what was happening. The lien on the house had triggered an automatic review of his business assets since he had used the property as collateral for several loans. The bank reported him for potential default. His credit lines were suspended, his partners were notified, and an internal investigation began. That's the thing about pride. It always leaves a paper trail. He had tied his entire empire to a house that was never fully his. And now, the system was pulling the thread that connected everything together. By afternoon, I heard from one of his old friends, a man who used to work with me back when I still managed projects. He said, "Your boy's in trouble." The investors pulled out of his deal. The bank's legal team showed up at his office today. I didn't act surprised. I just said, "Paperwork doesn't lie." Later that day, I went to the small cafe near the courthouse and sat by the window with another cup of coffee. I imagined him pacing his office, calling banks, shouting at assistants, trying to figure out what happened. That's how pride sounds when it collapses. Loud, desperate, and confused. At 4 p.m., the lawyer called again to give me the update that ended it all. The official notice of property seizure and pending review had been delivered. It was attached directly to his business accounts, meaning he could not operate, transfer, or use funds until the court cleared ownership. In simple words, his life had stopped moving. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing joyful about it. I just felt calm. Justice doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like balance returning. That night, I sat on the same bench outside the park where I'd slept just days earlier. Back then, I had nothing. Just a small bag and my dignity barely holding on. Now, the same world looked different. The air was lighter. The streetlights didn't sting my eyes anymore. Maybe because I finally understood something simple. Revenge isn't about hurting someone. It's about restoring order. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing. More messages came in from him, longer, more frantic. "Please, Dad, talk to me." I didn't mean it. "They're saying I could lose everything." I read each one, then put the phone back in my pocket. Sometimes silence is the best answer. The next morning, the newspaper had a small article on page 5 about financial irregularities involving his company. No names were mentioned, but I knew. His name wasn't in the news yet, but it would be soon enough. The sting had landed. Not a punch, not a fight, just paper and patience. And while he tried to clean up the mess he made, I sat quietly, knowing the storm he started had finally found its way home. It happened on a Friday evening. The sky was gray, the air thick with humidity, and I was sitting outside the small cafe I had started to visit every night after everything unfolded. I had a cup of black coffee in front of me, half cold, and a stack of papers folded neatly in my pocket. The same papers that changed everything. I didn't expect to see him that day, but a part of me knew he would come eventually. Pride never disappears quietly. It always returns when desperation kicks in. Around 6 o'clock, I saw his car turn the corner. It was the same car he had once bought using my name for the down payment, bragging to everyone that it was his. Now it pulled up to the curb like a wounded animal limping home. He stepped out slowly. No more expensive suit, no more smug smile. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoes muddy, his face pale. He looked older, not in years, but in spirit. The kind of aging that happens when life stops giving and starts taking. He saw me sitting there and froze for a moment, like he was trying to find words that no longer worked. Then he took a deep breath and walked toward me. His steps were shaky, hesitant, unsure. I didn't move. I just watched. When he finally reached me, he didn't sit right away. He stood there, head down, hands shaking. The man who had once shouted, "This house is mine," couldn't even look me in the eye. Eventually, he sank into the chair across from me. His mouth opened, but the first few sounds that came out weren't even words, just breath. Then finally, the truth spilled out. He told me everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. How the bank froze his business accounts. How his investors backed out. How his phone wouldn't stop ringing with bad news. The mortgage company had served him with notice. His name was flagged for investigation due to unpaid liens. Even his car lease was revoked because the payments were connected to his frozen credit line. He said he didn't sleep for 2 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw everything collapsing. His company, his home, his image. He said he couldn't even walk into his office because the board was threatening to suspend him. I listened quietly, letting him talk. He kept glancing at me, waiting for me to say something, maybe even comfort him. But I didn't. I just looked at him. Not as a father, not as an enemy, but as a man watching cause and effect unfold in perfect order. Finally, he said the words I'd been expecting. "Dad, I'm sorry." His voice cracked. He said he didn't mean what he said that day, that it was stress, that he got carried away, that he thought I'd always be there to forgive him. He begged me to help him, said I was the only one who could reverse what was happening. He promised to fix things if I could just call the lawyer, release the liens, or talk to the bank. He said he'd sign the house back over to me, that he'd do anything. I sat there quietly, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup. I looked at his face, the same face that once looked down at me while I stood outside my own house with a bag in my hand. He didn't look like a winner anymore. He looked like a man who finally met reality head on. When he finished talking, I didn't yell. I didn't say cruel things. I didn't remind him of the night he pushed me out or the laughter that followed. I simply said, "The law doesn't move backward. What's done is done." He froze. His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew I was right. He built his house on borrowed ground, both legally and morally, and the ground had finally given way. He stayed sitting there for a few more minutes, silent. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a check, a final desperate attempt. "Take it," he said. "It's all I have left." I looked at it, then slid it back across the table. "Keep it," I said. "You'll need it more than I do." That broke him. His shoulders slumped, his head dropped. For the first time since he was a boy, I saw him cry. Not the kind of cry that looks for sympathy, the kind that comes from real loss, from understanding. He eventually stood up, wiped his face, and whispered, "I'll fix it." I didn't stop him. I just said, "Do that." He nodded once and walked away slowly. When he left, I didn't feel proud or happy. I felt something quieter. Finality. The circle had closed. The same man who kicked me out of my house was now the one asking for a place to stand. That night, I didn't go back to the shelter. I walked through the quiet streets until I reached the neighborhood again. I stopped in front of my house. The lights were off. The mailbox was stuffed with letters and warnings. It didn't look like a home anymore, just a building filled with consequences. I looked at it one last time and whispered to myself, he needed to lose it to learn. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the silence behind me. The world doesn't always need anger to deliver justice. Sometimes it just needs time. It didn't take long for the rest of the world to see what had already started crumbling behind closed doors. Within a week, the fallout went public. His company, the one he had spent years bragging about, the one he once said would change everything, began to collapse piece by piece. The first sign came quietly, through a short business article buried deep online. It mentioned financial discrepancies, liability disputes, and management restructuring. There were no names at first, but anyone who knew him would recognize the description. He had been the face of that company for years. His ego had made sure of it. By the next morning, the news had spread beyond the small article. Clients started pulling out. Partners refused to renew contracts. Suppliers froze accounts until investigations were complete. The same people who once toasted to his success began to distance themselves. That's how the world works. When you're on top, everyone wants to be near you. When you fall, even your shadow disappears. I didn't watch the news obsessively. I didn't need to. The lawyer called every day with updates, and I listened calmly. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. This wasn't about joy. It was about order returning to the world, an order that my son himself had broken. For years, he had built his name on borrowed foundations. My foundations. The ones I created with sweat and patience. The same foundations he kicked down when he told me to leave his house. Now those same foundations were dragging him back into the dirt. 3 days later, it became official. His name was printed in the local business paper under the headline, "Director Removed Amid Legal Review." I still have that paper. His photograph was small, but the look in his eyes said everything. Lost, cornered, exposed. He wasn't angry anymore. He was empty. The following week, his office board held an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, of course, but Mr. Haynes did. He told me everything afterward. The investors were furious. They accused him of misleading them, of hiding property issues and debt liabilities. When the truth came out, that the house he bragged about owning was legally entangled in my trust, they turned on him immediately. He was voted out as managing director in less than 15 minutes. No debate, no defense, just signatures. That same day, his company-issued car was repossessed. His office access card was deactivated. His personal assistant quit without notice. The man who had once walked into that building with his head high and his chest out had to be escorted out by security like any other fired employee. I didn't see it happen, but I didn't need to. I could imagine it perfectly. The silence, the stares, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway that used to be his kingdom. After that, the calls started again. This time they weren't angry or panicked. They were short and tired. "Dad, they took everything," one message said. Another, "I'm done." I read them all, but I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because he still didn't understand. It wasn't about what was taken from him. It was about what he gave away. Respect, decency, loyalty. Those things can't be bought back with apologies. A few days later, I drove past his old office building. The company logo was already being removed from the front door. Workers on ladders scraped off the letters, while people walked by without even looking. That's how fast the world forgets the proud. I parked the car for a moment and watched in silence. For a brief second, I remembered the boy he used to be. Curious, full of energy, eager to prove himself. Somewhere along the way, that boy had drowned in arrogance. That evening, I got one last call from my lawyer. Everything had been settled. The liens were cleared. The property was officially restored under my full ownership. I could move back into my house whenever I was ready. He said, "It's done." I thanked him, hung up, and sat quietly in the dark for a while. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt finished. Across town, my son sat in a rented apartment, broke, humiliated, and alone. The man who once said, "This house is mine," now had no house at all. The man who once laughed as I stood outside now avoided the world's eyes. And all I had done was wait, sign, and let truth do the rest. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Not because I destroyed him, but because I had reclaimed myself. When everything finally settled, I moved back into the house. Not with anger, not with pride, just quiet. The street looked the same. The neighbors still walked their dogs. The mailbox still leaned a little to the left, but to me, everything felt different. The air carried a weight of lessons that no one else could see. I unlocked the door with my own key, the same key I had held for years before being pushed out, and stepped inside. The house smelled like dust and cheap cologne. Empty bottles were scattered on the kitchen counter. The furniture was worn, not because of time, but because of neglect. He had lived here like a man who didn't care what he had. Now it was mine again. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood in the hallway for a while, listening to the silence. It wasn't the same silence that greeted me the night he threw me out. That one was cold, heavy, full of pain. This one was peaceful, final. The house had come full circle. The walls that once heard shouting now held calm again. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the doorknobs, the kitchen table. It all felt smaller than I remembered, but maybe that was because I had grown in other ways. The first thing I did was open every window. Fresh air poured in, sweeping out the stale smell of arrogance that had been sitting in there for months. Then I took a broom and started cleaning. The old me would have hired someone, but I wanted to do it myself. Every sweep of the floor felt like reclaiming something, not just the house, but my dignity. The next day, I called a repairman to fix the loose step on the porch. It was the same step I had tripped on the night I left, the one I promised myself I'd fix if I ever returned. Watching him hammer it back into place felt symbolic, like closing a chapter that had been open too long. I also planted new flowers by the walkway, bright marigolds and white lilies. My wife used to love lilies. She would have smiled seeing them bloom again. The neighbors came by as I worked. Some avoided my eyes out of guilt for not helping before, but a few greeted me warmly. One older woman said, "It's good to see you home again." I just nodded and said, "It's good to be back." Days passed quietly. I cooked my own meals, cleaned my own rooms, and sat on the porch every evening with a cup of tea. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened, but inside, I could feel the calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about winning. It was about balance. I had given my son everything: money, shelter, trust, and he had turned that gift into entitlement. The house had become a battlefield of pride. Now, it was a reminder that peace only belongs to those who earn it. Every now and then my phone would buzz. It was him. The messages were shorter now. "How are you? Do you need anything? Can we talk?" I always replied with something simple and polite. "I'm fine. Take care. Maybe one day." I wasn't cruel. I just knew distance was necessary. He had to live with what he'd done, the same way I had to live through what he caused. One Sunday morning, as I sat reading the newspaper, I saw a small story about him. Nothing dramatic, just a mention that he had started a small consulting job for another firm. No titles, no spotlights, just work. It made me smile slightly. Maybe he was learning. Maybe losing everything had finally taught him the value of earning something the right way. I don't think I'll ever forget the night he pushed me out, or the look on his face when he realized what I'd done. But I also don't hold hatred anymore. I've learned that revenge fades, but lessons stay. He got his lesson. I got my peace. That's enough. Now every morning I sit on that same porch with the repaired step, tea in hand, and watch the sunrise hit the front door. It feels new again, not because it's different, but because I am. The house stands quiet, solid, steady, exactly how it should be. And sometimes, when the wind passes through, I swear it whispers the same thing I tell myself every day. You took back your home, and yourself. When I look back now, I don't see revenge. I see balance. I see an old man who refused to stay broken. My son once stood in this same doorway, pointing at me, telling me I didn't belong here anymore. He believed ownership came from shouting the loudest, from taking what you want, not earning it. But time has a way of humbling pride. The same key he took from me is now back in my pocket. The same ground he called his now holds only my name. But this story was never about a house. It was about respect, and how fragile it becomes when greed replaces gratitude. There are days when I still think about how easily it all happened. One moment, I had a home, a son, and peace. The next, I was standing on a street with a bag in my hand, watching the door close in my face. The memory isn't painful anymore. It's educational. It taught me the most important truth: love without respect becomes weakness. And when people mistake kindness for surrender, they forget that silence isn't always defeat. Sometimes silence is preparation. He thought throwing me out would make him powerful. He thought money and property made him untouchable. But when the law caught up, when his own paperwork turned against him, when the same foundation he stole began to collapse under his feet, he finally understood what I had been trying to teach him his whole life. You don't build success by stealing from the hands that raised you. You build it by earning, by honoring, by remembering who gave you your start. I didn't destroy his life. I let his choices do it for him. The house, the business, the money. They were never the real loss. What he lost was the one thing you can't buy back: reputation. Once the world stops trusting your name, it doesn't matter how many doors you try to open, they all stay locked. I never gloated about what happened. I didn't tell neighbors, I didn't post about it, I didn't brag. I just lived quietly, like I used to before all the noise. The peace I have now isn't loud or dramatic. It's simple. I make my coffee, water my flowers, and sit by the window watching the morning sun hit the floorboards. The same floorboards I once built with my hands. The same ones he stepped over to push me out. They creak a little now, but I like that. It's a reminder that even when things get old, they still stand strong if the foundation is right. Sometimes, he calls. His voice is softer now, slower. No more arrogance, no more pride. He talks about finding small jobs, saving up, trying to rebuild. He doesn't ask for help. Maybe he's too ashamed. Maybe he finally understands that the best apology isn't words. It's change. I listen, say a few kind things, and let him talk. That's all I can do. I'm not his enemy. I'm his lesson. If I could tell him one last thing, it would be this. I didn't take revenge. I took responsibility. Responsibility for the house I built, the name I carried, and the dignity I refused to lose. He called it punishment. I call it consequence. Because in life, what you do to others always circles back, especially to the ones who gave you everything. I keep one of his childhood photos on the shelf. He's smiling in it, holding a toy hammer, pretending to build beside me. Every time I look at it, I don't feel anger. I feel sadness for how far he drifted from that little boy. Somewhere along the way, he traded gratitude for greed. But deep down, I still believe he can find his way back. Not to the house, but to himself. Now, the house is quiet again. The nights are peaceful. No shouting, no arguments, no heavy footsteps. Just silence. The kind that feels earned. I sit in my chair by the window, watching the sun rise through the same curtains I hung 20 years ago. I take a slow breath and remind myself, sometimes the best revenge is living well, quietly, in the peace they thought they could take away from you. He said the house was his. He said I was finished. But today, I sit in that same house, free and calm, and the world feels right again. Because he lost everything he took, and I regained everything I earned. And that's not revenge, that's justice.